On the morning of June 20th, 1815, a rumor tore through the London Stock Exchange that would outlive every man who started it. The rumor said that a courier, riding through the night on a chartered boat and a string of exhausted horses, had reached London hours before any official dispatch from the battlefield in Belgium. The rumor said the courier worked for the house of Rothschild. The rumor said that Nathan Mayer Rothschild, standing at his usual pillar in the exchange, had heard the news, kept his face perfectly still, and then quietly begun selling government bonds, convincing everyone watching him that Britain had lost, triggering a panic, buying up the entire market for pennies on the pound, and then, when the official word of Wellington's victory finally arrived, revealing that he had known all along and had just made the single greatest fortune in the history of finance in one morning. It is one of the most famous stories ever told about money and power. It has been repeated in newspapers and economics textbooks and conspiracy forums, and in at least one Hollywood-adjacent dramatization, retold so many times across so many mediums that most people who repeat it today have no idea it originated anywhere at all. It simply feels like something everybody has always known. And as far as historians who have actually gone back to the primary sources can establish, almost none of it actually happened the way the legend claims. This is the true story of what the Rothschild family actually did during the wars against Napoleon, and it is in its own way far more revealing than the myth that replaced it. To understand the real story, you have to go back further than Waterloo, back to a cramped 5-story house on the Judengasse, the walled and gated Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, where Jewish residents were required by law to live and were locked in every night, where a coin dealer and moneylender named Mayer Rothschild was slowly, patiently building relationships with the ruling house of Hesse-Kassel in the closing decades of the 1700s. Life on the Judengasse was cramped and precarious by design. The street itself was barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. Residents faced periodic waves of official harassment and outright violence, and Jewish merchants across the German states operated under a maze of restrictive laws that limited where they could trade, what professions they could enter, and even how many Jewish families were permitted to marry and remain in a given town in any given year. Mayer had started as an apprentice to a banking family in Hanover, learning the trade of dealing in rare coins and antiques before returning to Frankfurt to build his own business, eventually becoming a trusted financial agent to William, the Landgrave, and later Elector of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest princes in the Holy Roman Empire, a relationship built initially on nothing more than Mayer-Amschel's reputation for honest dealing in rare coins, and his willingness to extend the kind of specialized credit services larger, more established Christian banking houses considered beneath their attention. Mayer-Amschel had 5 surviving sons, and he made a decision, unusual for the time, that would define European finance for the next 2 centuries. Rather than keeping the family business concentrated in one city under one heir, the way most merchant dynasties operated, he sent his sons out to establish banking houses across the continent, each answering to the others, each reinforcing the family's collective strength. Amschel, the eldest, stayed behind to run the original Frankfurt house. Salomon went to Vienna, Karl went to Naples, James, the youngest, went to Paris, and Nathan, the 3rd son, headed first to England in 1798, at just 21 years old, initially settling in Manchester to trade in textiles, the industry where he first built up his own working capital, before relocating to London around 1809 or 1810 to establish what would become N.M. Rothschild and Sons, the London house that would eventually eclipse all the others in wealth and influence. The symbol Mayer-Amschel eventually chose for the family's coat of arms, once the Rothschilds were elevated to Austrian nobility in 1817, captured this strategy precisely, a fist gripping 5 arrows bound together, representing his 5 sons, and the principle, reportedly passed down as something close to a family motto, that 5 bound arrows could not be broken as easily as 5 separate ones. It was a deliberately old, almost biblical image, but it described a genuinely novel financial structure for its era. Most European banking houses of the period were tied to a single ruler, a single city, a single set of local politics, and could be ruined entirely if that one relationship soured or that one city fell to an invading army. The Rothschilds, by contrast, had built something closer to a single institution operating simultaneously inside 5 different political systems, capable of moving capital, information, and risk between them faster than any government could track, let alone control. That structural advantage, established well before Napoleon's escape from Elba, is what actually explains the family's later success at Waterloo far more convincingly than any single act of market manipulation ever could. By the time Britain found itself locked in a prolonged, grinding, continent-spanning war against Napoleonic France, a conflict with intermissions that had by then run for the better part of 2 decades, Nathan Rothschild had built something no other banking house in Europe possessed in quite the same integrated form: a private courier, an intelligence network stretching across the continent, with brothers stationed at key financial centers in Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, and Paris who could move information, and, more importantly, move gold. faster and more reliably than most governments could manage through their own official diplomatic and military channels. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't some mystical financial genius operating in isolation. It was engineering, built brick by brick over years. Fast boats chartered specifically for the purpose. Paid agents stationed along established routes, contacts cultivated with customs officials and local merchants on both sides of a war-torn continent. The Rothschilds had built, in effect, a private postal, courier, and logistics service years before Waterloo, originally simply to keep their own 5 branches coordinated on prices, exchange rates, and business opportunities across borders that armies were actively fighting over. And this network became extraordinarily valuable to the British government for one specific, deeply unglamorous, and almost entirely overlooked reason. Wellington's army, fighting in Spain and Portugal against Napoleon's forces in what's known today as the Peninsular War, needed to be paid in actual gold and silver coin, not paper credit or promissory notes, because local Spanish and Portuguese merchants and the allied Portuguese and Spanish troops fighting alongside Wellington simply wouldn't accept British paper currency as reliable payment in a region with no functioning banking infrastructure and constant political upheaval. The problem was that moving large quantities of physical gold across an entire continent at war, past French naval blockades, hostile territory, and the ever-present risk of simple highway robbery was a nightmare of logistics that the British Treasury and the Bank of England itself were struggling badly to solve on their own through official channels. Nathan Rothschild solved it, and he solved it at a scale and with a reliability that stunned the British government officials who worked with him. Starting around 1811 and accelerating dramatically through 1813 and into 1814, acting essentially as the British government's private financial agent under a formal arrangement brokered with the Commissary-in-Chief, John Charles Harries, Rothschild organized the purchase of enormous quantities of gold and silver coin from across the continent, sourced from mints and merchants in Germany, the Netherlands, and even, through discreet intermediaries, France itself, in a detail that would have scandalized the British public had it been widely known at the time, since it meant British gold to fight France was, in part, being purchased with the cooperation of financial channels running directly through Paris, and arranged its transport through continental banking networks, getting it safely into Wellington's hands in Spain and Portugal. Historians who have examined the surviving treasury records estimate the sums Rothschild moved on Britain's behalf reached well into the millions of pounds sterling, an almost inconceivable sum for the period, representing a staggering logistical achievement conducted largely in secret, since revealing the specific routes and methods would have handed Napoleon's forces and their intelligence services an obvious target to disrupt. Wellington himself, in later correspondence, and in testimony to a parliamentary committee, acknowledged directly how critical this financial lifeline had been to keeping his army fed, equipped, paid, and functioning in the field during the final decisive campaigns of the Peninsular War, at one point remarking that if it had not been for the money arrangements made through Rothschild's network, he did not know how the army could have kept the field at all in the final, most demanding phase of the campaign. The arrangement with Harries had begun almost by accident, when the Commissary-in-Chief, desperate for a solution after conventional channels through the Bank of England repeatedly failed to move sufficient specie quickly enough, was introduced to Rothschild through intermediaries in the city and found, to his evident relief, a private financier willing to take on both the logistical risk and the currency conversion risk that no official government department wanted to touch. Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, Nicholas van Sittart, worked directly and repeatedly with Rothschild on these transfers, a level of direct cooperation between a private Jewish banking house and the British state treasury that was, for the period, genuinely without precedent. This was not the action of an outsider gambling on a war from the shadows, waiting to profit from whichever side won. This was a financier who had made himself structurally indispensable to the British war machine itself, years before Napoleon's final defeat, embedded so deeply into Britain's own military logistics that Wellington's ability to keep fighting depended in part on Rothschild's competence. So by the time Napoleon escaped his exile on the island of Elba in late February of 1815 and marched back into France to reclaim his throne, triggering the frantic period known as the 100 Days, 100 days that would end at Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild wasn't a bystander waiting on the sidelines to place a clever bet on the outcome. He was already one of the central financiers of the entire British war effort against France, deeply exposed, both financially and reputationally, to whichever way this final unexpected renewal of the war went. The escape from Elba had genuinely shocked European capitals. Napoleon had been exiled to the small Mediterranean island under the Treaty of Fontainebleau after his first abdication in 1814, with the other major powers assuming, wrongly, that his political career was permanently finished. When he landed back in France on March 1st, 1815, with barely 1,000 men, and marched north toward Paris, gathering troops and popular support at every town along the way, the soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined his march, and King Louis XVIII fled the country within 3 weeks. The Congress of Vienna, still in session redrawing the map of post-Napoleonic Europe, immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw, and the major powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, began mobilizing armies for what everyone understood would be a final, decisive confrontation. For a financial house as deeply invested in a British victory as the Rothschilds had already become through years of war financing, the stakes of this sudden, unexpected renewal of the conflict could not have been higher. Now here is where the legend and the historical record begin to diverge sharply, and it's worth walking through the actual claim piece by piece because some parts of it hold up far better than others. The popular version says Rothschild got secret advance word of Wellington's victory on June 18th and used that advance knowledge to deceive the market on June 20th. The historical record tells a messier and in some ways considerably more interesting story. Rothschild's courier network did, by most credible historical accounts, likely bring him early word of the battle's outcome, probably arriving in London sometime on the 19th or very early on the 20th of June, which would indeed have put him meaningfully ahead of the official government dispatch carried by Major Henry Percy, which didn't reach the cabinet in London till quite late on the night of the 21st. That part of the legend has real defensible grounding in the fact that private commercial networks in this period frequently did outpace official military and diplomatic channels, simply because merchants had every financial incentive to build faster systems than any government bureaucracy typically bothered to. But the specific theatrical detail at the center of the legend, the idea that Rothschild then engineered a market crash by pretending to sell, projecting despair on the trading floor as if Britain had lost, deliberately triggering a panic among other traders who followed his lead, only to then quietly buy up the entire depressed market before revealing the truth. That particular dramatic sequence appears nowhere in any contemporary account written in the actual summer of 1815. It shows up decades later, and the version most people know today was substantially popularized nearly a full century after the battle, in a series of French pamphlets published in the 1840s, most notably one written in 1846 by a French journalist and pamphleteer named Georges-Marie Mathieu d'Erneville, titled, in translation, roughly, The Edifying and Curious History of Rothschild I, King of the Jews. The pamphlet was explicitly and viciously anti-Semitic in both its content and its stated purpose, part of a wave of financial conspiracy literature in mid-19th century France that used the enormously prominent and genuinely powerful Rothschild name as a stand-in for a much older and uglier stereotype. The scheming, disloyal Jewish financier secretly manipulating Christian nations and profiting from Christian bloodshed while owing loyalty to no country at all. D'Erneville's pamphlet sold in the tens of thousands of copies and was reprinted repeatedly across Europe over the following decades. The Waterloo trading story, in its familiar dramatic form, was substantially his invention, or at minimum his elaboration, built loosely around the kernel of truth that Rothschild probably had received early news of the battle. The story didn't stay confined to French anti-Semitic pamphlets either, and its spread across borders and decades is itself worth tracing briefly, because it illustrates how thoroughly a piece of fabricated financial folklore can outrun its own origins once it acquires enough narrative momentum. It was picked up and further embellished by later writers, including in an 1887 book by an English author named John Reeves, and it resurfaced with renewed and far more dangerous intent in the 20th century, when Nazi propagandists in Germany explicitly revived and amplified the Waterloo legend as part of their broader campaign to portray Jewish financiers as secretly controlling world events, most notoriously in a 1940 Nazi propaganda film titled simply Die Rothschilds, produced by Joseph Goebbels' ministry and designed to cast the entire family, and by extension Jewish people generally, as the hidden manipulators behind European wars and financial crises. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this particular legend, and it is a truth that most retellings of the story today, including plenty of otherwise reputable finance and history content, simply leave out entirely. Much of the story's most dramatic and memorable detail wasn't preserved by careful historians working from primary sources. It was manufactured, decades after the fact, by anti-Semitic propagandists with an explicit political agenda, later amplified by a genocidal regime for the same purpose, and it has been repeated largely uncritically and often with no awareness of its origin. Ever since, right up to the present day, including by people who have no idea where the story actually comes from and simply find it a satisfying cinematic tale about clever financiers outsmarting everyone else. What actually happened to Nathan Rothschild's finances in the aftermath of Waterloo is both less cinematic and honestly considerably more impressive as a piece of financial strategy, precisely because it required patience and nerve sustained over years, rather than a single clever trading maneuver executed in a single morning. Rothschild had spent the war years, going back well before 1815, accumulating British government bonds, known at the time as consols, short for consolidated annuities, at what were historically depressed prices, because a nation fighting an expensive, uncertain, decades-long war against Napoleon carried enormous ongoing risk, and risk depresses bond prices in any era, since investors demand a discount to compensate them for the possibility of default or of a prolonged, ruinous conflict. Once Napoleon was decisively and finally defeated at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, and it became clear over the following days and weeks that 2 decades of nearly continuous continental warfare were genuinely, permanently over, British government bonds began a sustained, powerful, months-long rally, because the fundamental risk premium that had suppressed their price for a generation had simply and permanently vanished overnight. Rothschild, holding a substantial position built up patiently over years of accumulation, rode that recovery to enormous profit. His fortune wasn't made in a single morning off a single deceptive trade executed on the floor of the exchange. It was made through a multi-year position, held through the war's greatest uncertainty, through years when a French victory or a negotiated peace favorable to Napoleon remained entirely plausible outcomes that paid off enormously once peace finally definitively arrived. The kind of return that goes to whoever has both the financial strength and the psychological nerve to hold risk that everyone else is too afraid to hold for as long as it takes to pay off. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth being explicit about why, because it changes what the story is actually about at its core. The myth says Rothschild profited through manipulation and deceit, tricking a panicked and gullible market through theatrical performance. The real story says Rothschild profited because he had built, over nearly 2 decades of patient, unglamorous work, the single most sophisticated private financial and logistics network in Europe, made himself genuinely indispensable to a government's war effort at the most critical possible moment, absorbed and priced risk that everyone else in London was too nervous to touch, and was rewarded in the end when that risk resolved decisively in his favor. One version of this story is a story about a swindle, a single deceptive act you can point to and condemn in isolation. The other version is a story about what financial power actually looks like when it is built deliberately, patiently, over a full generation. And arguably, the second version should worry you considerably more than the first, not less, precisely because there is no single dramatic villainous act to isolate and condemn. There's just a family that spent 20 years outbuilding everyone else in Europe and collected the entirely legal, entirely foreseeable return on that 2-decade investment of effort. There's a related detail worth addressing directly, because it circulates almost as widely as the core Waterloo legend itself. The claim that Rothschild's network relied on carrier pigeons to beat official government messengers across the Channel. This detail appears constantly in retellings of the story, often presented as established fact, and it too turns out to be considerably shakier than its popularity suggests. There is no solid contemporary evidence that pigeons played any meaningful role in Rothschild's Waterloo-era intelligence gathering specifically. The pigeon detail appears to be a later embellishment, likely borrowed from the genuinely well-documented fact that Rothschild and other European banking houses did use trained pigeons for rapid communication in later decades, and retroactively grafted onto the 1815 story to make it feel more elaborate and more secretive than the comparatively mundane reality of fast boats, paid riders, and a well-organized relay system along established roads. The real mechanism was less exotic, and again more revealing. It was organizational competence sustained over years, not a single ingenious gadget deployed at the decisive moment. It's also worth understanding exactly how the London bond market of 1815 actually worked, because the mechanics matter for evaluating just how implausible the full theatrical version of the legend really is. The market for consols operated through a relatively small, tightly networked community of brokers and jobbers who worked in close physical proximity at the Royal Exchange and the nearby coffee houses that served as informal trading floors, and who watched each other's behavior obsessively for any sign of information advantage. Nathan Rothschild was already, by 1815, one of the most closely observed men in that market, precisely because his network's speed and reliability were widely known and widely envied among his rivals. The idea that he could have staged an extended days-long performance of visible despair, convincingly enough to trigger a market-wide panic among traders who were actively watching him for exactly this kind of signal, without any contemporary trader, journalist, or diarist recording the specific performance at the time, asks the historical record to support a great deal of coordinated theater that, if it had actually happened as dramatically as the legend describes, should have left far more contemporary trace than it did. What the record does support is something quieter and more consistent with how markets actually move. A well-informed, heavily capitalized trader with a large existing position, watching a genuine and finally resolved 20-year risk evaporate, and acting accordingly over the following days and weeks as the broader market gradually absorbed the same news and bond prices climbed to reflect it.